So now we're going to move on to our next speaker, who is Elizabeth Stockdale. So Liz is head of farming systems and agronomic research at NIAB, and has over 25 years experience of research and knowledge exchange in soil management, nutrient cycling and environment impact. She currently leads the AHDB and BBRO funded soil biology and soil health partnership, which developing practical on-farm tools for monitoring. And I think we're going to hear about that now. So over to you, Liz.
Thank you very much. I'm just doing that check thing because it's difficult to tell from where I am that everyone is seeing my screen.
I can see it fine, that's good.
Thank you. So I've been involved in soil science since the early 1990s as a student at Newcastle, just to make sure I get that mention in, and was one of the last graduates of proper soil science, as we like to call it, at Newcastle, and really wanted to become a soil surveyor, but just at the point that the Soil Survey of England and Wales was kind of not out of choice, but retrenching. And so I became an agricultural scientist, working with farmers, looking at and exploring how their soils functioned, particularly in the context of soil fertility, which became a wider focus. And that focus became the question, well, what are my management practices doing to my soil? Every time I went onto a farmer wanted to discuss how to make their soils better, or how to understand what impacts their management practices were having. And certainly from the 2010s onwards, whatever we call those, that interest and that engagement has just been growing and growing. And so the project that I lead, funded by UK levy money from AHDB across the whole of the AHDB sectors, and the British Beat Research Organisation, brought together a large research partnership, applied science researchers from across the UK, ADAS, ourselves at NIAB and SIUC, with FARA, Game and Wildlife Conservation Trusts and other key partners too, to really see if we could advance our understanding of the soil biology. That was the perceived and actual gap in terms of being able to make and understand measurements in soil, but in particular, and the bit I want to talk about today, how to combine those in a way that made sense for farmers. So we began that approach by just kind of doing what you always do in that scenario, actually just having a look at what we knew. And I think really important in the context of farmers, and perhaps even more so for policymakers, it became really important to stress that soil health wasn't the whole thing here. That actually it was really important to understand, yes, that soil classification stuff, not necessarily in its full beautiful glory, but nonetheless to understand that the soil type sets the inherent limits to what can be done on a site. If we don't know about that soil character, we can't actually contextualize the health of that soil. So oil land is unique, it might have those unique constraints, those kind of frameworks that pre-exist all of this conversation in things like agricultural land use capability. But when we then begin to benchmark or think about how we might benchmark this concept we call soil health, we recognise that it's management that modifies the properties, and it's those things that farmers are interested in knowing whether they're moving in the right direction or not, and consequently whether the soil is able to deliver the functions it needs to. So here the target was to understand and to enable farmers to take informed action based on some simple measurements. The aim wasn't to develop, and I can do this just like Jim, a complex philosophical understanding of how soil health works. Jim and I have fantastic conversations at that sort of level, but we also have fantastic conversations that are about, well, what exactly should we measure? And actually, if we do measure that, what should we do about it? So this framework of those interacting physical, chemical and biological properties has become seen in pretty much every advisory document pretty much across the globe. This idea that it's important to give farmers advice that integrates their management and recognises the importance not only of the chemical and physical structure of the soil, those things that, well, in my training as a soil science back in the 80s, we really focused on, but also those biological interactions, and the recognition that actually management has a critical impact on those interactions as well as those individual aspects. So we began in the project by putting out a load of leaflets, and I'm just going to show you those. if any of you are involved in education, things like the Principles of Soil Management is a really slim version of a soil science textbook for land managers. We've also done some focus work on measuring and managing soil organic matter, and some of you would have been in a room in Peterborough where I beat you to a pulp and didn't let you out of the room until we'd agreed some general principles and advice that we could pass on to farmers, which has been caught up and encapsulated in this leaflet and soon to become a series of leaflets, Managing Soils for a Sustainable Future. And that grouping of soil scientists, agronomists, but also farmers, NGOs, and a whole range of others. The UK Soil Health Initiative is continuing to where it needs to come together to drive and inform that practice development and advice. So the heart of the Soil Biology and Soil Health Partnership was our valuing of what was already happening on farm. Our experience in ADAS, SIUC and NIAB was that farmers were already, and are continuing to do since, innovating on farm to improve their management of soils. They were looking at new approaches to tillage, new ways to incorporate organic matter into crops, and many other things, sometimes with scientific and researcher support, and often without. And I didn't make this lovely farmer in the Scottish uplands pose for this photograph. I just noticed on the way through a set of photos at one point that actually the key here is that those farmers are taking care of and, yes, loving their soil. So that biological, physical and chemical interaction is the heart of what we're looking at here. And what we're aiming for is to recognise what farmers are already doing and to build and strengthen that. So farmers were already making observations, taking bags of soil away from the field and sending them off for analysis. And that was particularly to get whole field or perhaps field management zone level averages for the levels of nutrients or of pH, so they could guide their fertiliser management and their liming strategies. Equally, farmers were doing targeted assessments when they were just before a tillage operation, or even better, some months before a tillage operation was planned, to investigate actually what the current state of the physical structure of the soil was, particularly in the context of where compaction was occurring and what extent and depth that was occurring too, so that they could plan their tillage operations. So two different approaches to soil assessment there. But actually, if we want to bring this all together, to put the biology, physics and chemistry together, we need to recognise the importance of those, but also to do something different. And this is recognising the importance of that need to understand these trends through time. So if we take a bag of soil or take a targeted compaction assessment and then go back in 3 to 5 years' time, the chances are we'll sample different by meters or tens of meters bits of soil into our sample. And here, and if we're looking for trends through time, site-specific repeated point measurements are the kind of gold standard in science, and so they need to become, and actually they're relatively easy to implement these days in farming systems. They've always been okay to implement. We can line ourselves up with a tree and a gate post and put ourselves back within about 5 meters of where we were before, but of course now we can do that a lot more accurately by recording GPS pins in Google or using the lovely what 3 words to identify the sites. So we're linking now our physical observation and our soil samples sent for testing. They're not being done in different times and different ways. Those different ways of making assessments still exist and are still important to drive those different management practices. But what we're doing now is wanting to go back to the same place regularly, and when I say regularly, about every 3 to 5 years, so that we can understand the trends and changes in our soils through time to guide our understanding of whether the management practices farmers themselves are doing are keeping the soil, in good health, or whatever other jargon we want to do. We're aiming for this rotational level assessment, and it's a GP's sort of level of assessment. This isn't a specialist piece of work. This is something that actually we want farmers themselves, or certainly their advisors, to be able to do. And actually, if there's an issue here, if there's a problem located, just like when we pop to the GP for one of our regular health checks, what will happen is we'll be referred on. So here, if a problem emerges, something looking a bit odd, we can do more testing, or we can refer to a more detailed specialist. So we're using these geolocated points My experience of sampling in the field for quite a lot of years is that in a field, squares are a nightmare and circles are quite nice. So if I put my bucket down at my centre point and stay within 5 metres of it, that's giving me a reasonably large, but also reasonably coherent, as long as I'm careful about where that location is, repeat point sampling. So I'm doing my in-field scoring for physical assessments of soil structure and earthworm counts, and we're extending that by collecting samples and sending them away for extended analysis. Now that process of getting to there is a complex one. This diagram represents an awful lot of conversations and an awful lot of locked doors until we agreed things. Those which indicators, how should they be sampled and analysed conversations. Those conversations that say, but what's the right number for organic matter and how should that be benchmarked? Those conversations that say, when you say organic matter, do you mean carbon or loss on ignition? And actually, do we need different sorts of indicators for each of those things? That combination of, well, really relevant and important farmer practical understanding of how these things change and what they already can observe and notice, alongside with the specific knowledge, the process mechanisms, the mechanistic models, all the statistical rigour that can underpin our understanding of how best to sample, but also balanced against what's possible and achievable, because actually samples that are taken robustly are useful, even if they're not taken in the perfect way that perhaps a scientist might manage. And all of this process needs to be embedded in the concept of, well, getting users involved and interested in it. Again, no point in having a perfect system for measuring soil health for farmers to use if actually they never use it. And so the end point here is to not just have a list of indicators, but to have a system that has categories and descriptors and takes us through the supporting information that allows a change in practice. So you won't be surprised to hear that we began by saying, well, it seems entirely logical that things that we've spent a long time in soil science arguing and already having discussions about, like, what's the right level of pH to have good grassland growth, might become and find their home within the scorecard. So existing indicators such as pH, routine nutrients, P, K, and G, bulk density, penetrometer resistance, visual assessment of soil structure as developed by SIUC and others, went in here really quickly, but some of them then immediately had some questions. Well, hang on, bulk density, marvellous measurement, fantastic, but is it really something that every farmer can do routinely? Or is it almost like the next level up, the specialist assessment, if something like your visual assessment of soil structure is showing that you've got a critical limiting layer? Penetrometer resistance equally, is that the kind of measurement we might use at rotational scale? Or is it something that actually is used for those targeted measurements? We're looking for compaction and where it is and how deep it is. And actually, therefore, measuring and using a penetrometer in this rotational way may not be quite so useful. So again, how do measurements fit together? We also looked where there were measurements that everybody said should be here, but weren't yet ready for rollout. So remember, we're back in 2017, 2018 here, where there were no clear frameworks for how to interpret loss on ignition or dew mass carbon measurements to give farmers an understanding of whether their soils had about the right amount of carbon for maintaining soil function. And we looked at a range of other measurements too, and we did this in a really integrated way using research sites and farmer sites and including both farmer and researcher assessments. And the programme is vast and will report in December. But what does the end point of this look like? I haven't got long enough to take you through it all, so let me just show you a couple of highlights. Back in 2018, we went to data that Verheyen et al., that Rothamsted through DEFRA projects in the early 2000s had brought together to look at whether there was a critical level of soil organic matter. And we recognised from Verheyen's work, particularly published in Soil Use and Management, that there was a framework there that actually could already be implemented on farm, but it just hadn't quite been so yet. And so we developed a really simple set of tables. This is just an example by rainfall region and taking into account soil texture. And for farmer use, splitting that texture into those simple cross compliance soil categories, so light, medium and heavy, where heavy is around more than 30% clay, light dominantly less than 18% clay. So we've got fairly broad bands here. So these are just indicators of where our organic matter might be. And we know, and we've looked at since the developing work at Rothamsted and coming out of Europe, that directly links organic matter and clay and sort of refines this interpretation within these cross-compliance sort of type categories. But immediately this gave farmers access to information they didn't already have and enabled a farmer I was working with to go, oh, okay, because he'd been measuring organic matter across his fields from a sandy end to a clay end, a great diversity there inside one field, and recognised that the clay soil had, well, that end of the field had higher organic matter and that end of the field had lower organic matter. And so in his management, he was already targeting his organic matter to what he thought was the right places. So his high organic matter end of the field was getting, well, not very much organic matter, and he was targeting his organic matter at the low end. But the high end was the clay, which for a clay had quite low organic matter, and the low end was the sand, which for a sand had quite a high level of organic matter. So actually, by simple looking at the numbers without an interpretive framework, he was actually doing his management backwards. And he kind of went, ah, that's why, when we talked it through. So these initial scorecards are not about creating a single indicator of soil health. They kind of dodge that challenge a bit because they recognise that to then make management change, even if we created a single indicator, we'd have to unpick it back into its individual indicators to work out which things to take action on. So basically we just wimped out and said it's more important, like when we go to school, that we have a scorecard of values against which we can be assessed. It's not so useful to know what my GPA score is, apologies to the US, but really useful to know if I'm good at physics and not so good at PE, so that I can target or adjust my management appropriately. We did these tests in long-term experiments, so this is samples taken in the grassland phase of one of the DG Agri long-term experiments, this one at Harper Adams, that had been applying different kinds of organic materials at farmer rates for quite a long time. Really just showing you that to show you that, well, this is what scorecards look like quite quickly. And we look very quickly and go, oh, look, that exchangeable or extractable phosphorus there is actually quite a big number. So we've got a need to review here because those have got quite a significant environmental risk potentially attached to them. This soil is naturally high in phosphorus. That's not a management output, but still worth a review. And we can also see the impacts here of those inputs of different kinds of organic materials. So our indicators are starting to give us the kind of clues that farmers are asking for across a range to understand whether their managements are making a difference. So we worked with farmer groups to develop and apply the scorecard for practical use, and I got to drive to all sorts of amazing places to have great conversations with farmers, to walk fields with spades and basically just to stand and watch as they dug holes, counted earthworms, scored for visual assessments, and then we collected and sent soil samples away for analysis. But what we were particularly doing here was thinking about how we supported farmer conversation about the numbers and how we helped farmers go that next step so that they really became engaged with using these results to change their systems. And that's the kind of craziness that you end up with. So that's just an example set of scorecards for, well, these are a whole set of rotations that include potatoes. So these are nasty, in inverted commas, rotations with high intensity tillage and you could argue potentially at least low organic matter returns. And what you see is there's a huge diversity in some of these indicators. The nutrient indicators are pretty much in the green, with some of them tending to, well, be either low or high, a little bit of variation about that, keeping things around what we would expect to be normal. But here in the context, and these are listed in terms in rank order for organic matter in these intensively tilled soils, remembering that they are benchmarked and coloured in that green, amber and red, taking account of their texture. So we've got a mix of light and medium soils here. We've got this organic matter at 7. Well, that's actually a history. That's an old heathland soil in Norfolk. they've got special names out there, the black sands, that is being used for potato production. That's not a management impact, that's a history impact, and actually one that needs to be looked at carefully. But even then, if we look down that list, we've got range of organic matter from really quite low and quite, you would argue, potentially risky to function in a medium soil, up to quite high levels. So there's no obvious potatoes are bad for soil here. There are different management practices within those rotations, and the best conversations come when those farmers get together to say, well, what are you doing that I could learn from? Notice just very briefly here, we've got the organic matter to clay ratio in here, and also indicators like the CO2 burst that we're also having a look at in relation to organic matter and so on. So we're just tidying up the end point of this to give those tools directly to farmers. And the tool is interesting, because what farmers said and what we thought we wanted to see were these trends through time. And so as a scientist, I immediately thought of graphs, because that's what trends are. And farmers said, oh, don't be silly. Graphs, especially of 9 or so things to look at, are really quite annoying. What we want to be able to do is see our scorecard and then physically on the screen, literally lift it and move it to be next to another one, so we can see how things have changed through time. We want to be able to compare scorecards one next to each other, not draw graphs with 9 lines on. And that conversation was facilitated and enabled by an interaction with the Soil Mentor enterprise, small business feeder cycle, who worked with us on our SARIC funded project. So the Soil Biology and Soil Health Partnership is coming to its end. It will finish at the end of December. It's been increasing understanding and discussion of soil health. We've been really focusing on developing the practical outcomes, enabling farmers to really engage with numbers, to engage with their soil test results and with measurements they're making in the field, to understand and begin to get a grip of how physical, chemical and biological things interact, but particularly driving, supporting their ability to select and then monitor change in terms of improved practices. And I think it's been really important for us that we've been able to value and recognise farmer innovation in this space to enable them to see what they're doing. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Liz. That was really great to get a practical viewpoint with respect to soil health. We have a couple of minutes for questions, so I'm going to pass over to Dan.
Thank you, Sasha, and brilliant talk, Elizabeth. We've got lots of questions coming in, but I've got only a couple of minutes here. So let's go to this one then, which is kind of a question about the depth of the soil. Do you have a view on how deep the assessments should go? This obviously feeds into a wider question, I guess, Elizabeth, of how deep a farmer should measure these indicators for the scorecard. Soils are 3 dimensions after all.
So we focused on topsoil measurements. We focused on the same sort of sampling depths as we would give farmers advice on in relation to sampling in the context of RB209. We will include in the advice the importance of looking at subsoil characteristics, so that we at least understand for monitoring sites what our subsoil characteristics are, and looking at the impacts around any sampling site in terms of risks in relation to observation of soil movement, capping and so on. And where those are occurring, there'll be a note to say topsoil VESS isn't sufficient, you need to look in more detail to see if there are issues in the subsoil. When we say subsoil, most farmers are not regularly touching soil below 35 to 40 centimetres in depth. And so it's that first key layer which is within their management scope, though the impacts of those wheels and large machinery can of course go a lot deeper. It's just really difficult to remediate. And so the focus there has always been on trying to help farmers minimise those impacts through things like controlled traffic farming, and flotation tyres and so on. So there's a balance here in terms of what we focused on for this project, and actually where our aspiration is to encourage people to also be understanding and measuring subsoils. And of course, in some landscapes, actually, it's those subsoil properties that are key to the impacts that are happening both on and off site.
Yeah, thank you, Elizabeth. And that may well feature as well in our panel discussions, quite a generic question as well that we could ask the rest of our panelists. Don't forget, you can add questions into the questions tab. We'll try to get through as many as possible, but the clock has just ticked to 10, so I'll hand back to Sasha for the next speaker. Thank you, Sasha.
Great. Thank you again, Elizabeth, for a fantastic presentation. Really enjoyed that. And as Dan said, please keep the questions coming.